I'm not sure who's doing the hosting and who's doing the co-hosting, but I guess I'll step in and say hello, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. Today,
Thank
we're
you,
going
Mark.
to. Were you supposed to do that,
I don't
or
know. I wasn't given any instructions.
yeah? Nobody told me. Nobody told me at all. So I'll just sort of jump right in. Today we have a very special guest with us, James Valiant, awesome guy, objectivist extraordinaire. In my opinion, and I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. And we're going to discuss an article that was posted in the Guardian today, and I don't have the material with me because I didn't expect to actually host. Do you have the title of the article, of the author, and can we start talking about the premise of this doggone thing?
Well, it was an article published in The Guardian, and it was about why, I don't recall the title, I did read the article, but it was about why it is that British youth are attracted to socialism. And is a phenomenon both in the US and in Great Britain where young people are disturbingly positive in their attitudes towards socialism. And given recent history, it's even more disturbing. But they raised issues such as the housing crisis, unaffordable and unavailable housing in Great Britain, and several other issues that are obviously the result of Britain's very mixed economy. But the blame is going from young people to capitalism itself. And in extraordinary numbers, 2/3 of British young people, the British youth, have positive attitudes towards socialism. A majority have a positive attitude toward Karl Marx. And it is particularly noted in young people these days. A similar but lesser phenomenon has been noted, and they noted it in the article, in the United States. A lot of college-age Americans, the bastion once of capitalism, where if you'd ask in polls decades earlier, do you have a favorable view of capitalism? Do you have an unfavorable view of capitalism? And same with socialism. Even with young people, you'd get a high, we like capitalism rate until recently. Young people, for some reason, on both sides of the pond, are feeling this weird attraction, and it's gotten viral on Twitter, and it's really a disturbing phenomenon.
Now, I think we have an answer to that question. Why are millennials so attracted to socialism? But the article never quite gets into root causes. All it does is list issues and then take the presumptions of the millennials as a fact, their quote lived experience, and provides that as the explanation, which just seem like presumptions to me. But it never digs beneath the surface and asks, why the sympathy? So let's get into that. Why do you think millennials, given the history that is socialism, why do you think millennials are gravitating towards it?
They were never really given an alternative. Capitalism was never really given an articulate defense. Socialism had a disastrous effect on Great Britain from the 1950s to the 1970s. By the late 1960s and throughout most of the 1970s, Great Britain was in a crisis, an economic crisis. The malaise in the United States looked mild compared to what was going on in Great Britain before Thatcher took over and denationalized so much of British industry. But when she came in, as great as Margaret Thatcher was, even she could not provide a moral defense of the free market and freedom. Nor did the idea sink, I think, with the youth that, in fact, the problem all along had been socialism and socialist solutions. Even the disastrous collapse of the Soviet Empire in the late 1980s. I mean, in the early 1990s, everyone thought, oh, communism's dead, communism's dead. But the fact of the matter is, communism is alive and well in English-speaking university campuses. It was the old joke, where do you find Marxists anymore after the Soviet Union fell? Well, in American universities. And that's kind of sad and true. Not in economics departments, interestingly enough, but in your philosophy and literature departments. That's where the Marxists are. So it's the moral defense of capitalism and a broader historical defense of capitalism that never sank, despite historical experience, dramatic historical experience. And you can break down the issue. You can say the reason why we have a housing crisis in Britain, or to a lesser extent, a housing crisis in the United States, has been a result of the government regulations. That idea has never really sunk. All these council programs in Great Britain. I was just looking this morning after reading the article at housing regulations in Great Britain. Holy moly, even after the so-called deregulation of 2015, Britain's housing industry remains so heavily regulated in every respect. There's no doubt in my mind what is causing expensive housing, unavailable housing on the British Isles. It is the absurd degree of regulations it takes to be a landlord. Britain never got over its aristocratic land control before socialism came plopping down on it. So it had all these noble titles and entail. How much of Great Britain is still owned by the Queen or by people with titles or by the government itself? And before that was actually ever dealt with in a fully capitalistic way, all of these semi-socialist regulations on housing and landlords and so forth, building codes, you name it, which have not made housing any safer, came down, increased the price for landlords, increased the price necessarily, as all regulations do. All regulations have a tendency to increase monopolistic abuse because you've increased the cost for new entrants. And therefore, of course, housing's a mess in the United States and Great Britain, just to take the top issue that they plucked out. But instead of seeing housing in that light, instead of seeing it either in a, wow, boy, socialism really failed us in all these other areas, morally and economically, without seeing that, and that would take proper education. So I blame educators. I blame the media too. The media never really got it. Never really got it. There's no great voices in English-speaking media, in British or American television, defending capitalism in a principled way, either economically or morally.
So the socialists took a moral tack to defending socialism, and the practical defenses are, for all intents and purposes, irrelevant to them, because what matters is being moral. So we know that the capitalists, the free marketers, have to not stop the practical attack on socialism and say, here's how it doesn't work, here's why it doesn't work. They have to shift their argument to a moral argument. And what is that moral argument? Before you answer that, I have to get to a couple super chat questions here. Roland Horvath with €4.99 says, is millennials a valid concept? Is millennials a valid concept?
I think that it is, I think it makes sense to measure generational attitudes, because you can, just as with an individual, you can judge dominant ideas, and just as a society is merely a collection of individuals, so you can assess the dominant ideas of any culture. That doesn't mean there isn't a significant minority here or there, disagreeing, but you can characterize a culture by its dominant ideas. And I think with a little less bright lines, with fewer bright lines, I think we can still say the same about generations. Each generation, and it's slow, and obviously it gradually evolves over time, but I think you can see a difference between, say, generations. And it becomes really clear, I think, in the United States over my 58 years of life. I've seen attitudinal changes among the young from the time I was a teenager in the 70s to the young people of today. And it's dramatic, So I'm not sure that we can have a bright line concept, millennial or Gen X or whatever the term is. I think it's a kind of a fluid thing. But on the other hand, I think you can sort of, in a general way, identify the dominant attitudes in a culture or in a generation within that culture.
Absolutely, I agree. Before we get into the moral thing again, I have another super chat from Mary Aline for $5 American. Government schools don't teach how many people have died under collectivism. Most young people don't do their own research. I don't know that they don't do their own research, but I don't know that the material is available to them in the public schools. And even in social media, most of them are getting their news from social media, which skews heavily left and is not even interested or aware of a moral argument for capitalism. That's my point of view. Regina gives us €2, €2, sorry, no question, but just €2, which is great. Now, so how do we make these adjustments? What moral arguments can we make? Let's make the distinction between what moral arguments does socialism make, Automatically, the name socialism seems to imply a moral context that capitalism does not. So, what moral arguments do they make versus the moral arguments of for capitalists?
Well, it's a huge mistake on the part of capitalists to, I think, get into the weeds of certain details. Is housing a good thing? Do people need housing? Obviously. Do people need food? Obviously. But that need does not tell us how it is best achieved, nor does that need give anyone a moral right to the product of someone else's labor. And the moral question that I think needs to be focused on is the one that Ayn Rand focused on: force, violence. Socialism presents with its mask as a system of benevolence. We want to help the poor. We want everybody to get these basic needs, food and housing and medicine. Presenting like that, it's, oh, gee, all they want is for people to have the things that people need. People do not recognize either the causal source of wealth, where it comes from, or which would in fact tell them how to get affordable housing for their masses best, nor do they see the relation between that practical issue and the moral issue that is government force. Government force. And that's really the moral question that it really needs to be boiled down to. If people could see the violence inherent in socialism, how people are pushed around, how it is worse when it comes, the solution to what? Private monopoly is one giant unstoppable government monopoly. If people could see the issue of force and could see that socialism is in effect slavery, just with a funny mask, I think that's the moral issue that we need to understand. And here Ayn Rand, of course, is the one who understands the nature of rights. Young people will talk about rights all the time: the right to housing, the right to food, the right to this. Well, wait a minute. A right to some material good implies that you have a right to somebody else's thought and labor, a kind of slavery. Once morally it is seen that socialism implies a kind of slavery, I think we win. I think we win. The other thing that needs to be shown is that slavery is not good for delivering the goods, in effect. And for that reason, for the very reason that it's slavery, the mind is impeded, progress is impeded, you're going to get worse housing, fewer housing, less housing, and that connection between the moral and the practical has to be collapsed. People are used to thinking of principles in terms of something other than the real world practicality. So that theory-practice dichotomy has to be collapsed, and the morality of socialism as slavery, the immorality of socialism as slavery, has to be made crystal clear.
They don't seem to, it doesn't seem to integrate for them the concept of slavery, because each according to his ability, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Places the upper classes at the service of the lower classes, and they see slavery as the exploitation of somebody above them, of somebody below them. So,
and with Europe's history of aristocracy, it's an easy thing. The Marxists were able to jump in and see all these rich people with their inherited wealth. That you're right. And so Europeans, unlike Americans, I think, and that's why things are a little better in America. Americans understand that you can go from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, right, in just a couple of generations. That never sunk, I think, in Great Britain. So the idea of earning and the moral value of the productive never is not even a concept, I think, that really sank in Europe.
So, how do you turn? I get that sense that we're Europeanized here, and people don't understand that it's possible to exploit somebody who is above you on the social ladder, just as it's possible for somebody on the higher on the social ladder to exploit you. That right. Slavery is a universal issue where anybody can be deprived of the right to their own life in various ways. So it cuts across class, and I think we'd have to show that. We have another a super chat from Mary Aline for $5. Thanks, Mary Aline. Leave people free. They will figure for themselves the best way to provide their own food, housing, and medicine. Independence is moral. Now, that's a hard thing to really get by. We're grappling with that now. Socialism has embedded in it the notion that we're all in it together, and we're all part of this organic unit, and we all work for it. Now, there's something romantic about that appeals, especially to the young mind. Now, it could be because they've been in that ideal has been embedded in them from cradle to grave. But the ideal of individualism, that you're an end unto yourself, that doesn't carry the romance that the sacrifice and the we're all in it together does. How do we make it romantic? I mean, we could look to Rand's literature and see how it's done there, but in our own terms, in our own way, in a way that's graspable to that millennial who might reject Rand. How do we make individualism romantic?
Well, to me, collectivism, there's nothing romantic about it. To me, it is a horror of concentration camps and slavery. To me, the idea of collective ownership is not just helping the needy. To me, it does directly imply slavery. And it's that concrete connection that needs to be understood. It's that concrete reality that needs to be understood. Ordinary landlords in the United States are typically middle-class people, not rich people. There are people who just have a second home or a third home that they rent out for supplemental income or something. 40% of all residential housing, or 40+% of all residential housing in the United States, for example, is owned by ordinary middle-class people.
By the way, this was a boon in capitalism, and the collectivists have characterized it as the sharing economy. When middle-class people had a second home and they Airbnb'd it to make more money, it was called the sharing economy.
Well, it's a bizarre conflation of ideas, isn't it?
Yeah.
Capitalism is about cooperation. They've created this straw man of individualism. See, if your life is your own, well, then you're just some atomized individual out for your own thing, and you'll step over dead bodies and not care. You don't need other people. That's just nonsense. Of course, we get huge benefits from other people. The question is, are we going to coordinate behavior at the point of a gun, or is it going to be cooperation, voluntary coordination of activity? And so long as it's a nonviolent activity, a peaceful, productive activity, the guns should be kept out altogether. It's the guns that cause the problem, whether it's government regulations or criminals. And that is the point that has to be practically driven home, and it can be practically driven home in 100 ways. But as I say, there's a couple of things going on here. The appreciation of production as a value. See, in Europe, the wealth was collected by unproductive parasites who were the descendants of people who stole it at the point of a sword. So they don't have an association of wealth with, you deprive the wealth, that's justice, that's Robin Hood. So communism had this moral premise that was semi-valid in the ideas of a lot of people. These people haven't earned their wealth, and a lot of Europeans, frankly, Americans who earn their money through government, haven't earned their wealth either. So that distinction between rich people who got it by being parasites and rich people who produced it, who are the benefactors of all mankind, that idea has not gotten through. The morality of production has never really been understood, and it's been confused by the idea of such as aristocratically inherited wealth in Europe, which sort of confuses the idea.
Now, the founders seem to understand that the government was a gun and needed to be restrained. When do you think, and I think the society as a whole understood that notion, when did that start to disappear in America?
And I think that, well, again, we have to come back to the idea that it never really got a good defense. The best intellectual defenses for capitalism that were being given in the 19th century, especially towards the end of the 19th century, were utilitarian defenses. Weren't really moral defenses. John Stuart Mill ended up a socialist. Herbert Spencer, the most articulate English defender of freedom at the turn of the 20th century, the late 1800s, he gave only collectivist justifications, in effect, for freedom. And it is that moral basis. And it is, as Ayn Rand said, it's the morally consistent who will tend to win the argument. Well, if your argument is a utilitarian, a mathematical argument about how we maximize housing for most people, well, it's a sheer mathematics, and then it becomes, this cruel mathematics of how we use our guns. Becomes what's considered moral. Instead of realizing that, of course, there can be no morality at the end of the point of a gun. In fact, housing itself is hurt. If you want abundant housing, let individual landlords make profit. That is the way to reduce housing costs, increase housing availability, to increase housing quality and safety and everything else. But that idea is just not sunk, and it never did in the 20th century. And so moral arguments, despite historical reality, the horrors of communism in the 20th century, the disasters of socialism wherever it's been tried, and the more consistently it's been tried, the worse the outcome. All of that historical reality is ignored by our academics. Ignored. They're not taught that. They're not taught that in media. They're not taught that 100 million people at least were slaughtered by communist dictatorships in the 20th century. Nothing like that. Young people don't even have an idea of the horrors of socialism. Yeah, and I again blame the academics. So it's both a historical lesson they need and, even more importantly, a moral lesson they need about where wealth comes from and the morality of production and the producer.
Amen to that. We've got $4.99 American from Jonathan Honig, always supporting the show and often co-hosting and hosting. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Mary Aline gives $2 American. Doing everything for a man destroys him. What do you say to that?
Oh, nothing could destroy a man more than doing everything for him. I am blessed to have parents who wanted me out of the house as soon as possible and earning my own living and not dependent on them. You got to make it on your own, kid. We're kicking you out of the nest. I think that was one of the best features of the American culture, frankly, and I was a blessed beneficiary of the attitude. Get out, kid. Make it on your own. It's all up to you.
Sure. Now, there seems to me that the idea of a virtuous circle is true. Like you get kicked out of the house and you start working for yourself. It creates a success that builds upon itself. Is it true that there might be a vice circle here?
I was about to say that I saw people, the children of the wealthy in particular, ruined their lives with lifelong drug addiction, total irresponsibility, never thinking for themselves, because that's where responsibility starts, and just coasting on some automatic. No, the worst thing you can do as a parent, a wealthy parent, is to spoil your kid that way. Kick him out of the house at 17, 16, 18, tell him to get a job in a factory or something. That's the best, most virtuous thing you can do for someone. Indeed.
And I think it's no mistake, given this scenario that you've shown us, that the children of upper middle class and wealthy people end up being these rabid socialists because they don't really they don't have a sense of where material values come from.
And they pick up the guilt so easily because, you see, they didn't earn it.
Right.
Why should I have this wealth? Because my dad or my granddad made the money, right? And so they are the perfect suckers for socialism's arguments about, the more immorality of the robber barons, for example. Why should I have this? I didn't see it. They didn't see grandpa's hard work or creative thought that actually made it possible, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I co-created a party called the American Capitalist Party to be in people's faces that capitalism is a good thing. I refuse to change the name, but do you think capitalism should acquire a different name to that, something that embodies the moral ethic as socialism has?
Well, we adopted the name from Marx. Marx was the one who gave capitalism that label, capital, right? And he thought it was all about the money. And if you look at the money, that kind of, does take kind of the romance out of freedom, achievement, right? What we're really talking about here, and I wish we did have a term that would focus on the fact that the free mind is what achieves new ideas and great new things. That positive thing is a screaming, when you look at history from one perspective, that is the screamingly obvious fact of history. It is the free creative mind that produces all the values that humanity needs and relies on so much. It is it's the freedom for you to be creative that allows you to find personal fulfillment in life. And both of those are true. And that idea has to be, and that moral idea has never been gotten through because it runs against Christian ethics, the dominant Kantian ethics of our time, the collectivist ethics that people have had ingrained into them. This issue is an ethical one. Really, it is an ethical one and a psychological one.
I agree. The most disturbing thing about this article to me was not just this, it's sort of old news now that the millennials are bending towards socialism. The most disturbing thing to me was the lack of curiosity on the part of the author. The fact that he took the presumptions of him or herself and the millennials as proofs and simply listed a bunch of concretes as evidence. There was no attempt at digging beneath the surface. Lived experience was the standard for truth. Was that more disturbing even than
Oh, yeah.
finding out these percentages? Because it says something epistemologically about the millennial generation, doesn't it?
Yes, and about the way the media covers it. Yeah, emotions are basically irreducible primaries. The emotions of the young people are just givens. If I feel this way because of this context, because this politician was this way and I'm in this context, that's it. No further analysis. We don't expect young people to think. We don't expect people to, we don't expect, it was a given. Their opinions are there.
Right.
There's nothing we can do about it. Yeah, that is the most disturbing. As if emotions are the standard and as if taking a poll about emotions answers questions. And that was the attitude. And that is the epistemological attitude of the media, trained by their university professors in journalism and communication schools. People's attitudes are just givens, they're emotions, and those are facts that we start with. The idea of going behind them to look at what mistakes they may be made, what moral premises they may be assuming, that doesn't go on. And that is far more disturbing because, of course, it's the media and our education system that feeds back on the attitudes of the young people and confirms in them, yeah, that's right, that's not fair. I should have X housing or housing at X price.
Well, not only that, but when we're talking about persuading people through a moral argument, what good is persuasion if somebody's epistemological faculty has been so damaged that they don't understand what reason is? They don't
Yeah,
look any further than their immediate experiences.
pragmatism, Wittgenstein's nominalism in Europe, those things have conditioned people to think of principles as fluid. You really can't stick to, you can't be wedded to some rigid principle. We have to be flexible. We have to compromise. And so that when people throw out, well, I don't mean to be a communist. I just want sensible housing regulations. I just want housing to be affordable to the poor. Well, they seem moderate, middle of the road, not an extremist. And let's face it, nominalism, epistemology, nominalism and pragmatism have convinced, in effect, British and American people through their universities that you don't want to be too rigid about your principles. You don't want to be, you don't think in principles, in fact. That's an old-fashioned idea, and we're not going to get anywhere that way. We have to some kind of compromise. And in that compromise, of course, we take emotions as givens.
Yeah, certainty is definitely passé nowadays.
Right.
Even in crazy intelligent, smart people I just have discussions with on Facebook, the idea of certainty is an anathema to them. They hate that.
Right.
At best, you can get even guys like Peter Boghossian, who's right now in the middle of rebelling against the academic institutions. I
Yeah.
don't know that he'd go any further with knowledge than to say it's provisional, right?
Right.
I don't think he would like the concept of conceptual certainty. And so in a sense, they all fall into that radical skepticist.
It's a funny thing how dogmatic they are about that, how absolutely certain they are certain that there's no
Right.
certainty. Nor when you press them a little bit, you ask, well, how are you calculating probabilities if there isn't something with a probability of 1, a 100% chance? How about the laws of probability themselves? And that, of course, those are the kind of questions they're never going to ask themselves. But that is, of course, what thoughtful philosophers would do, and is a default of philosophy that allows people to get away with this anti-principle, anti-conceptual thinking about topics, this emotional way of looking at it.
I do think we're in more of a mess than we were in the late 60s.
Yes, this is worse. This is worse than, the violence in one sense was worse in America in the late 60s and early 70s, the Watts riots and so forth. I think the violence was at least as bad as it is, and boy, has violence gotten out of hand in America now. There are cities ablaze with crime because, of course, local authorities are letting violent criminals simply get away with it outright. So we have a crime crisis in the United States, and one that has an ideological component to it, no doubt. But I think in terms of violence, the 60s may have been worse, but in terms of ideas, in terms of the actual attitudes of young people, there was a far more anti-establishment. I just went to the theater a couple of weeks ago to see a reboot of the play Hair, the hippie musical, right? And
Yeah.
what I noticed in that hippie musical from 1968-69 was that it was anti-government, anti-authoritarian, pro-individual freedom in a way modern leftists are not.
Mm.
They didn't trust the Democrats. They didn't trust what they wanted to was to go off and do their own thing in a very radical way. They didn't trust the media. They didn't trust Democrats. And there was sort of a quest for individual freedom, totally subjectivist, totally emotionalist, also a corruption in my mind. But in a sense, the left has declined in one sense. They are willing to accept authority. They're willing to accept the media as authority. And so they're more amenable to censorship, say, or they're more amenable to just accepting what authorities tell them without any protest or individual variation being the hero. So instead of the radical individualist with his long hair, sort of rebelling against society, we're now our modern radicals are now lockstep conformists.
Indeed, they are, and they're rejecting. I mean, I feel like the radicals back then, as emotionalist as they were, and as ideological as they were, in some respects, attempted to appeal to logic and reason. I think we're seeing a rejection of logic and reason now. We're seeing a rejection of reality, of identity, in favor of everything is a construct of your mind and society.
That's
And
right.
that's very, very scary. So, are you going to join us on Clubhouse?
Uh, I don't think I have time this afternoon. That kind of came up on me as a surprise of doing this morning. But what fun! No, I don't think I'll be able to make it on later up today.
Okay.
But keep
Well,
the discussion going. The discussions are always great. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thanks for being with us today, James. Are you doing anything now that you want to tell the people about, or do you want to? I mean, most of us know where to find you, but if you want to tell us anything new.
Well, through the Ayn Rand Center UK, we are doing one of the most exciting things that we do with the Ayn Rand Center UK are these Saturday discussions, these seminars on Leonard Peikoff courses. We're starting a whole new course
Wow.
on Saturday, Moral Virtue by Leonard Peikoff. And for subscribers, one of the great bennies is that you can actually participate in and actively participate, asking myself questions that you have on it. And we're starting Moral Virtue, and these discussions of these Peikoff courses are sort of an in-depth way for serious students of objectivism to get into it. So let me put in a plug for those, our Saturday meetups. They're always very valuable. I get stuff out of it, and I know most people that participate do. So please come join us on Saturday.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have a couple announcements here, folks. Physics by Phone with Dr. Amanda Maxim, 7 p.m. UK time, and HBTV with Dr. Harry Binswanger, 8 p.m. UK time. This isn't controversial. Abortion is right. That's going to be the subject. That's going to be the subject of the next talk. So,
As long as we avoid controversial topics around here.
right. I did a debate with Zuby Music. I don't know if you know Zuby.
Yeah.
He's a prominent conservative rap artist, and we did a debate on Town Circle. I took the pro-abortion side. He took the anti-abortion side under all circumstances, and I was pro-abortion under all circumstances.
Right.
And it made for I don't know if it was interesting, but it certainly went round and round. But thanks for joining us, James, and I hope to have another one of these with you.
Yeah,
it was awesome and stimulating and great hearing your point of view. And everybody else, thanks for joining us here at the Daily Objective, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
take care.